Welcome back to the Free Spirits Podcast, where we explore the functional beverage space, changing how we socialize. I'm your host, Lars Miller, here as always with my co-host, David Gonzalez. Quick reminder, if you are enjoying the show, do us a favor and rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help us find more listeners like you. Today, we are joined by Kevin Provost, CEO and managing partner of Greenhouse Ventures and co-founder of More Better. Kevin's career spans building sales teams, launching accelerators, and advising entrepreneurs in cannabis and hemp. Welcome, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Great, thanks. How you guys doing?
Great.
Good.
So, like I mentioned in the intro there, you've built sales teams, accelerators, venture studios, and obviously now you're working in the cannabis and hemp space. What experiences from your career best prepared you for the work you're doing today?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Long and short of it is, for the last 10 years, me and a couple partners of mine in Philadelphia have been working in the cannabis and hemp space. Before that, we were building early stage ventures that needed alternative finance as an access to capital. So crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, anything non-traditional bank related. That was in 2012 to 2015, and we ended up having a bunch of cannabis companies actually come to us during that time that we didn't know how to service. So we turned down a lot of early plant touching companies from the West Coast. We're based in Philadelphia, but we had a lot of West Coast cannabis companies looking for access to alternative finance between 2012 2015. At some point in 2015, one of our earliest hires, Doutrich, came and said, "Why don't we just build a program specifically for cannabis programs or cannabis companies?" And so that's what we did in 2015. That's how Greenhouse Ventures was formed. We opened up an accelerator program back in 2015, which was a 10-week, 90-hour curriculum-based and mentorship-based program. And between 2015 and 18, we put close to 40 companies through an accelerator program, taking minority equity stakes in those companies. Most of them were ancillary in nature. A couple of them were plant touching, including one of the first 20 hemp farms here in Pennsylvania. But most of that work in the cannabis space, we were comfortable doing because of our background building sales teams and working with customer service teams, where we got a real good understanding about coachability, resiliency, and domain expertise. So the people that we really like to work with are those three things: coachable, resilient, domain experts. In the cannabis industry, we saw a lot of domain experts who knew a lot about a very particular part of the cannabis industry, but not a whole lot about maybe the rest of the business. And so most of our prior work really influenced our thesis in Greenhouse, which was find the experts who know a lot about a certain part of a business, but who also want to outsource everything else. And with what they want to outsource, does our skill set fit their needs? And that's kind of how we played initial matchmaker. In my prior life, I was a door-to-door salesman and built door-to-door sales teams. And there's 8 work habits that they preach in most door-to-door sales environments that are, have and maintain a positive attitude, be on time, be prepared, work a full day, work your territory correctly, respect the client and the customer, recognize your opportunity, and take control. And so those 8 things, I feel like I stay in my sleep, but those really also dictate just how we look at business. If you don't have good work habits, if you don't have a good attitude, if you're not recognizing opportunities and taking control of those opportunities, we probably don't want to work with you. But those are also the characteristics we look for in partners and employees. And so that's a little bit of how, prior to life impacted what we started with Greenhouse and kind of what our initial investment thesis was. At the end of the day, even taking a minority investment equity stake in 40 some companies between 2015 and 2020 is more or less of a law of averages, where we took 40 shots on goal, a handful went in the net, and an even smaller amount stayed in the net. That's also kind of a salesperson mentality of, you take enough shots, some are going to go in, some will, some won't. Who cares? Someone's waiting, right? So I'd say that's kind of the backstory.
So Kevin, before we dive into the study here, one of the questions I had is, can you help bridge that gap from Greenhouse Ventures to More Better? How did that come about, and what is that for people who aren't familiar with what More Better is, what it does? So how do those two things kind of connect, and where did that come from?
Yeah. Greenhouse Ventures as what is today a venture studio and half a decade ago was an incubator and an accelerator, had a thesis built around distribution on one hand, data and research on another, and education and events on a third. So most of the businesses we invested into fit somewhere at the intersection of distribution, data and research, education and events. More Better was one of the first companies we took equity ownership in 15 through our accelerator program. We were 5% equity owners in the company back then. 2020, Greenhouse Ventures, we kind of realized that minority equity stakes in a lot of companies wasn't bringing dollars into the bank. And so we needed to pick a couple companies to triple down on that we had a high conviction rate with. And More Better was one of those companies. So over the last decade, we've increased our ownership percentage to be majority owners and primary operators of the company. That's fast forwarding Greenhouse Ventures from a decade ago to today. That's what we as a venture studio do today, is take minority equity stakes, transition them into majority equity stakes, go from advisors to more of a primary operator role. And More Better as a company really for the last 10 years has been collecting formula to outcome data for cannabis companies specifically, even though half of our book of business is now in other functional ingredient categories like kratom and kava and canna and adaptogens. What we do on a daily basis is figure out what products work best for what people in the population and why. So collecting longitudinal usage data is the number one way that we do that, where people use a product for a specific reason, and over the course of a couple weeks or a couple months, they want to understand what impact is that product having on a particular condition like pain or a particular wellness state like sleep or energy. And so fast forward to today, More Better as a data and research company has what we believe to be is the largest formula to outcome database in the world. That database has been used to be published in over 17 different medical journal publications. We provide anonymous and aggregate data insights to regulators at the federal and state level so they can figure out how to improve their state's programs and how to regulate hemp and cannabis federally. But then we also feed that data back to healthcare professionals, to formulators at the manufacturing level, and obviously back to consumers so they can figure out what products work best for them.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of those studies. You guys did an infused beverage study been a while back now. That's gonna be the bulk of the rest of the show here is getting into the different parts of it. But how did the idea first come about, and what was the problem you were trying to solve for the category with the study?
Yeah, I mean, as a contract research organization, More Better is used to clients coming to us and saying, we have a formula we think is good for sleep. We want to measure it. Help us measure it, find statistically significant data, and give us a data report. And that's 80% of our business. But in the recent years, we noticed certain sectors of the cannabis industry that were really lacking in data as a sector that were also being publicly talked about in the zeitgeist or in the media in the absence of such data. And so 2 years ago as a company, we decided to prospectively try to collect certain data sets in niche categories where we felt if we achieved a certain mass of data in this category, it could help the operators in the industry and potentially lawmakers, legislators, lobbyists who are trying to get laws passed at the state or federal level in relation to cannabinoids. So infused beverages, as you guys know, in the last year or two has just exploded in terms of the market presence, specifically on the hemp-derived side, specifically outside of state-regulated markets. And so we, in the last year, saw a lot of states like Texas, New Jersey, Kentucky try to make state-level decisions about how to regulate these products, but they were doing so in the absence of such data. And so what's nice is anecdotal feedback that infused beverages are improving quality of life and leading to better sleep and leading to less alcohol consumption. But unfortunately, laws aren't made with anecdotal feedback, especially anecdotal feedback that comes from a specific brand who may or may not have a selfish motivation to only talk about the positive. We decided after interviewing 80 different infused beverage makers that the time to launch a study was ASAP. And so this past spring, we recruited 20 different brands 15 different brands who provided 20 different products to go through a 3-week longitudinal usage study where for a week people were not using an infused beverage, and then for 2 weeks they were. And so we got a good before and after view of how infused beverages impacted things like alcohol consumption, sleep, depression, anxiety, stress over the course of those 21 days. And so we can get into detail about how exactly we did that. But the short answer of why infused beverages and why now is states are making laws. They're making laws in the absence of such data. And if you guys have ever walked into a place where THC beverages are sold and you stand around long enough, what you're going to see is a bunch of consumers walk up to a shelf, stand in front of a shelf, look around, and be very puzzled about what to buy, why they should buy it, which products are different. And so between consumer education and ideally influencing legislation, those are the two reasons for why now. But in reality, there's a dearth of real world data across the cannabis industry. So anything that we can do to get insights from people who are using specific products over an ongoing period of time, that data is very helpful for everyone in the supply chain, including the stores who are carrying the products.
Yeah, Kevin, I think it's important too to jump in and highlight a few of these specifics of what More Better focuses on as opposed to some of the data that exists out there. And what I've appreciated about the conversations that you and I have had is historically, when you go look at cannabis data, it's all about sell-through. It's all about what were the sales, what's the sales velocity, where is this product sold, et cetera. But I think you're kind of completing that end loop, which is saying that's one thing to sell, it's another thing to see if this product actually works. And I think beyond that, not just does this work, but who specifically does this work for? We see this happen time and time again where person A tries a gummy, they're knocked off their ass. Person 2 tries a gummy, didn't feel anything. Same thing with beverage. Someone might feel incredibly intoxicated off of 2 milligrams, and somebody might say, I can drink 10 of these at 10 milligrams. And so focusing on that side of the equation to me is very fascinating. You know, going back to the origin of this study, based off a lot of the experience you guys had from previous studies, did you have any predispositions or any hypotheses going into the study, expecting to see,
Yes.
I don't know, maybe alcohol substitutions, wellness outcomes, something else entirely? What were those initial hypotheses going in?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll spend a minute on before my expectations, kind of how we arrived there. But probably worth noting, as a company, More Better was founded because one of the co-founders' moms had an awful time navigating dispensaries back in 2015, where she walked in, got some products, and they had an adverse event with her. And so she called her son and said, I'm never using cannabis again. And her son, as a technologist, said, well, Mom, we can build you an app for that. So Relief app, ELEAF, Relief app, is a cannabis journaling tool that we put out in 2015, iOS and Google Play Store. It's still the #1 most frequently used cannabis journaling app on the market, the highest reviewed as well. We got into the business because of that exact problem. I am also the son of a family physician. If it's not in the New England Journal of Medicine, my dad doesn't buy it. So the only thing I have is real world data at scale to be able to present back to him if it's not in the New England Journal of Medicine. So personally, this is a problem that we all really care about within the company. That's #1. #2 is since COVID, the FDA has prioritized collecting real world data at scale, double-blind clinical placebo-controlled studies. And that is true because when we all had COVID, they needed to collect data from a bunch of people who were sitting at home and couldn't come into a physical site to get blood samples and hair samples and saliva samples and all that fun stuff. Right? Market timing also plays a role in this. We've been collecting data for 10 years. Nobody in the cannabis industry cared enough to pay for that data until 2 years ago. So for 8 years, More Better was operating essentially at a loss, being funded from other efforts. And it wasn't until 48 or 24 months ago the cannabis industry stakeholders started paying us for the data, paying us to collect data prospectively. So I think that's also just a market maturity indication. In terms of what was our original hypothesis with infused beverages, we hear the anecdotal, right? Of I'm drinking less, I'm sleeping better, overall my mood is a little bit better the next day, right? So things related to hangover, things related to the volume of alcohol consumed, and does this curb your desire to have an alcoholic beverage? We see a lot of that in the reviews that brands have on their websites or from friends and family if we've ever been in an environment where they're sampling these products. Outside of reviews and sampling events, brands don't really get the opportunity to get longitudinal usage data where they can, survey people who've used products for 2 and 3 weeks in a row and then understand statistically, is there any difference in the alcohol they consumed, the amount of hours they slept, their overall depression and anxiety. And so, hypothesis, we thought we would see some reduction in alcohol consumed. We thought we would see improved quality of life. We thought we would see minimal hangovers, all of which proved to be accurate in the data. I actually thought we would have more negative reviews in terms of the taste of these products because I'm a bit of a food and beverage snob myself, and I don't love the taste of most of them. That said, there's sweet sodas, there's sugar-free seltzers, there's spirits, there's drink mixes. I think we've gotten to the point where there's kind of something for everybody. And the study was structured in a way that participants could pre-select based on a one-sentence description the flavor they wanted, the form factor they wanted, the milligram of THC or cannabinoids or other active ingredients they wanted, without knowing the brand that was producing it. So what that ended up doing was leading to many fewer people disliking the taste of the product that they were mailed. To put it in perspective, each individual used one product during the 3-week study. So each brand mailed one product SKU to an individual based on what they selected, and then they used that one product for the 2 weeks following the 1 week where they gave us data without using the product. And we can get into some of what we learned and who those people were that enrolled in this study, but that just in general also limited the negative feedback, I think, because people were opting in to a specific flavor that they were exposed to, a specific milligram percentage that they felt comfortable with. And so we didn't get a lot of that poor taste feedback or didn't like the form factor feedback that I thought we might get some of that.
Okay. I want to dive into a couple of points you made that I think are important to highlight. So the first one you mentioned was you guys internally had an inclination that you were sitting on a gold mine of information, albeit the outside end user might not have recognized that value until recently. I think what comes to mind for me is I wonder if a reason for that could be specifically because of the contrast and the points of distribution of hemp products versus dispensaries. Meaning, if I have a goal to sell into Total Wine, or if I have a goal to sell into Walmart or a chain of gas stations or all these places, these are industries that already are very sophisticated data operators. And they're going to ask you questions, they're going to hammer you on certain data points, and on the dispensary level, it might be a little bit more less prudent to have all that information on hand. So I do wonder if it's this distribution network for hemp beverages that has led to this data becoming more and more valuable for you guys internally. But the other thing I think is really important, not just on the research level for the individual participants, but on the brand level, having that longitudinal data, when you go have those distributor conversations, when you go pitch retailers, when you can back up what you're actually saying with proof, now you're helping that retailer overcome some of that maybe lack of trust that they might be accustomed to. If they're getting pitched by hundreds of products and everyone's saying we're the best, we're the most potent, we're blah, 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 how can a retailer or a distributor really trust that that's true? But if you come to the table with a study that is, again, done by a third party and you have concrete metrics that you can show them, I think that's a really valuable piece that it doesn't just make your data more valuable, but it also opens up a lot of doors for where you can get your product as well. So I did want to just double click on that piece first before we jump into the actual nuts and bolts of the study as well.
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure the demand that we've seen in the last 2 years is there because in the last 2 years, the distribution network has really opened up. And like you mentioned, the dispensaries have had a tech stack for a while that's allowed them to collect data in the regulated state markets, but very different in the independent convenience store or liquor store or smoke shop, all of which have varying levels of sophistication in their own technology. So at the end of the day, the only data those places are getting anyway is sell-through data and foot traffic data. They're not getting the usage data unless brands are bringing their own often biased data from surveys to the retailers and the distributors. So, two things that you mentioned. One, the sophistication of the market probably makes that true. Two, the difference between brands doing their own studies versus having a third party do it. And this is like consumer insights 101, but both buyers and consumers trust third-party data way more than they trust data coming from an individual brand or manufacturer. When an individual brand comes to a wholesaler and says, look, we conducted our own study, here's the data, that's one thing, especially if it's on a couple hundred people. When they come and say, look, a third party conducted this, and here's how our SKU compared to the other 20 that went through the same study, that's another thing. The third thing is when they can say, we're the 2% of the industry that actually pays for this research to be done and then uses this research to educate consumers and retailers. So what's interesting is, we put 3,000 people, over 3,000 people enrolled in the first cohort. Roughly 2,500 of them completed the study in a high enough percentage that we included them in that completion rate. Those 2,500 people on a daily basis gave us feedback for 22 days in a row. Okay, so for 22 days in a row, they were telling us things like, what setting did they consume the product? What was the onset? How long did that onset last? So even though it was only 3,000 people, we have like close to 30,000 responses from those people on set and setting, close to 30,000 responses on dosing and how long it lasted. So even at that scale, you can get some pretty statistically significant insights on how these products are working for different sectors of the population that ended up using this product or these products. And, some of the surprising things for us, 25% of the 3,000 people who enrolled had not used cannabis at all in the weeks leading up to the study, meaning they were probably new cannabis users or people who maybe use cannabis at most a couple times a year. And then another 25% reported only using cannabis 1 to 3 times in the last 2 weeks. So cannabis newbies. So like 50% were novice or newbies in this study. Granted, we did filter out for daily cannabis users. We didn't want daily cannabis users to be skewing the data too much. And some did get into the study.
That's how I got kicked out. Yeah. I was curious.
Yeah, that's how we ixnayed you, Lars. Sorry, man.
Yeah. So you kind of walked us through this a little bit already, but you kind of started answering my next question, which was who participated, how long did it run, and then ultimately what were the endpoints that you tracked throughout the study. So it sounded like there was over 3,000 in the additional cohort. Have you done a second cohort already?
The second cohort's being announced the third week of September.
Gotcha. Okay. So we have one cohort done already. And you gave us a few stats there already, but and it ran for 3 weeks, one week prior, then 2 weeks with the
correct
taking the products. So that was the first part of the question. What were the endpoints that you tracked throughout those 2 weeks? Well,
so we used a couple of what they call validated assessment tools, which are research tools commonly used by researchers to measure in a self-reported environment things like sleep, quality of life, depression, anxiety, stress. So I mentioned those specific 3 things because those are 3 validated assessment tools that we used. One to measure sleep, one to measure DAS, depression, anxiety, and stress, and one to measure quality of life, which is kind of related to mood. So those were the specific things that on day 0, day 7, day 14, and day 21, at 4 different moments in time, we measured. Between those time periods on a daily basis, we were also measuring alcohol consumption, other cannabis consumption, and things like pain and daily stress, sleep, anxiety. So we were able to get day-to-day statistical significant changes, week-to-week statistical significant changes, and then overall statistical significant changes. That's what we were measuring. On the 22nd day of the study, we also did an exit interview where we were able to capture a bunch of data that didn't require longitudinal usage to get. So just things like highly agree, highly disagree statements, looking back on an individual's past 3 weeks, how much do they agree or disagree with the following statement? And what that allows us to do is see how faulty the memory is of the individuals, but also just get that, okay, I've used this product now for 2 weeks. How do I think it helped my sleep? Regardless of what I reported on a day-to-day basis, right? Because sometimes people care more about their own feelings than they do about the data. And so really important to get that exit interview done in a way that captures the look back. And we also were able to get likelihood to recommend, likelihood to purchase, all that type of data on that last day.
So, Kevin, what would you say are some of the either most important or most surprising results that you found? It could be around alcohol consumption, quality of life, product experience, and were there any results that you think could actually shift how regulators, investors, or retailers view this category in general?
Yes. So I will put the caveat out there that we're not completely done crunching the numbers. So some of these numbers might change a little bit. But yeah, so the 3 or 4 points that I think are more interesting, some of which may be able to impact the regulatory conversations. In terms of alcohol, there was a statistically significant probability of consuming less alcohol over the course of the study. That's number one. Number two, maybe more importantly, was people who reported consuming 3 or more drinks that first week and in the weeks leading up to the study went from 38% likely down to 25% likely to use those to consume 3 drinks by the end of the study. So heavy users consuming less alcohol by the end of the study, which if we're talking about population studies and the potential to save lives and prevent alcoholism, it's that category of people that we're probably looking at, not the category of people who have, one a day or less than 1 drink a day. So that's interesting. Going from 38% to 25% just over a 3-week period is pretty significant.
Okay.
50% of participants indicated they would consider the infused product that they just used as a regular replacement for alcohol. So I don't know how many beverages you guys have ever had in your life where you had it and said, yeah, I'd replace my preferred alcoholic beverage with what I just drank. But I love me some alcoholic beverages, and I haven't been able to say that about any particular infused beverage that I want to replace my preferred alcoholic beverage with what I just drank. But 49.2% of people said they would. So that's kind of interesting. 52% of people indicated by the end of the study that they have or will purchase that particular product again in the future. So just in terms of looking at a sips to lips sampling program, if 1 out of 2 people are saying they already have or they're going to buy it again, that's great.
Absolutely.
And then, look, 81% of people said they felt this product matched or exceeded their expectations. 93% of the people said that they liked doing this longitudinal study and they want to do more. There were significant improvements in quality of life. There were statistically significant improvements in the hours of sleep that people were getting, the quality of sleep they were getting. So, even though that's only a half hour to 45 minutes more sleep, a lot of people would take a lot of supplements if they could get an extra half hour to 45 minutes of sleep. So we think all of that is very positive. And some of that reinforces our hypotheses that we had going into it. I didn't expect 1 out of 2 people to say that they would replace their preferred alcoholic drink with the one that they just chose. That to me is one of the more interesting ones. What else I will say, which we did not expect to see, people who reported smoking cannabis during the study. We saw statistically significant reduction in inhalation and people using smoking, combusting, or vaporizing while they were using the infused beverages. So that's another kind of like health impact that I think regulators care about. And between the alcohol impact, the smoking impact, the quality of life impact, and the sleep impact, those are like the 4 data points that when we publish this industry study, we're going to put front and center. And we hope as a sector, everybody can kind of stand behind those data points.
Yeah. So that kind of leads to the next question of, most of our listeners are either founders, co-founders, or work in the industry. So for those listeners, how should they be thinking about using this kind of real world data, whether that be, marketing, going to distributors, whatever it's going to be?
There's six ways, and they're all kind of marketing related. But one is product description pages on the website. If you have data that your product performs a certain way, you should make a product description page that is data rich. And we can give you guys some examples to share to the world of, like clients of ours who have done this. Product description pages that are rich with data perform better. Better click through, bigger shopping cart size, more frequent and fast returners for returning purchases, better referrers and affiliates. So that's number one, is product description pages. Number two, in-store displays. If you walk into any alcohol retailer right now and you see a big display of beer next to a big display of THC beverages, the only difference is the letters THC. There's no information explaining what this THC beverage is, but there's a lot of real estate there on signage to put data points. So data on displays, number two. Number three, QR-based education for consumers. In-store on displays while they're sitting there waiting to check out, they could be scanning codes. On the packaging, most QR codes go to a COA. They could go to a product information page that includes the COA, but also includes all of this data. On packaging itself, QR codes can also obviously go on. Fourth area, B2B sales sheets. Right now, less than 3% of the industry has this data. If you are one of those brands that has the data, you've got a reason to differentiate on your one-sheeter to your distros, to your retailers, to your wholesale accounts, why they should pick your product versus the next guy's. Fifth, sampling events. A lot of on-premise sampling, a lot of conferences, a lot of trade shows where sampling is taking place. Great opportunity to not only display data, but QR code, get people enrolled in giving you data. And then the fifth thing is more in the research space, but white papers and pushing towards publication. So we are going to be retrospectively taking this data and working towards scientific paper publications. At minimum, we know of a couple brands who went through this first cohort who are making their own white papers. So those are the 5 or 6 ways that are mostly marketing related. Not marketing related would be the seventh, which is R&D and formula testing, right? Ideally, this data is ABC tested before products come to market. And you can run batches of 25 to 50 people through 3 or 4 different formulas before you come to market so that you know exactly how to market the product once it's live. Marketers and R&D people are usually the individuals who get the most value out of this data. I didn't mention it, but maybe it's obvious. Just anything consumer facing, guys. Consumers standing in front of the wall of THC products, not knowing which to purchase and why, screams for education. We think QR codes are a real fun, engaging way to do it, but I bet you any brand that has significant distribution in alcohol wholesalers, if they came to those wholesalers with big old displays that were consumer guides to picking a product, I bet you they would put up those signs for free in those stores. So
Yeah, Kevin, I think there's a few themes in that answer that are very important. So the first one is, I think you and I had talked about this. There was a McKinsey paper that came out, I think last year, around like why people buy certain wellness products. And I think it was the leading factor, at least in 2024, 2025. The number one thing that got somebody to trust and buy a purchase was if there was data around that product. It's basically analogous to, again, you're not going to trust it coming directly from a brand, but if there's a third party that is saying, we tested this, we have no bias, here are the results, here you go, and it is a positive thing, then a consumer is going to have that trust. And the reason that's so important is because in a commoditized market like this, where there are so many drinks, and to your point, a consumer walks in, has no idea how to differentiate between all of these different beverages. If there is something that stands out on that shelf that says this is effective and it works and it's proven, here's how it's proven, that is kind of that first step in building what's been missing, which is brand equity. Somebody's going to come in and say, I know this product works for me. May or may not taste good. That's not necessarily the criteria, but if this is effective, that's what makes it sticky. That's what helps with those repeat purchases. That's overall just building trust with that individual brand. And I think a non-THC example of this playbook that's been executed at scale incredibly well is the gummy company Grüns. And Grüns went from zero to about a $500 million valuation in, I think, 18 months. And a lot of that was because, Kevin, to your point, they basically took the AG1 formula and said, this is chalky. I don't want this in a beverage. I'm going to put it in a gummy. But they did a ton of testing on getting the right combinations, getting the ingredients also have a good flavor profile, but they lean into that heavily throughout all of their different marketing channels, which is this is not just another group of people who threw together a product. This is a methodically designed and engineered product that leads to these outcomes. And to me, that's an incredibly important thing to pick up on for any brands listening, because you are competing against, I think Whitney Economics put out a report today on the hemp industry. I think it was like 750 beverage brands. It's a lot of people to be competing against for only a select number of distributors that are carrying these products, and a select number of retailers as well. And so having this data as a tool in your arsenal that exists across all these different touch points, not only are you enforcing why your product is better to the consumer, but if your consumer is your wholesaler, or excuse me, if your customer is your wholesaler and distributor, you're also bringing that to the conversation as well. And so, Kevin, to your point, there are now 3% of brands that can confidently do that and say that. And that's an advantage that they're getting over the rest of the other 97%.
Well, David, let's put a number on it, right? So 63% of participants in the study indicated they would be willing to pay more per unit if the product was marketed with scientific data. The average amount is between $1 to $2 more per unit.
So there's margin there. Yep.
And the next most likely category, by the way, is between 50 cents and $1. So it's actually, if you combine those, it's a real high number. Yeah, I mean, that to us is kind of like canary in the coal mine, right? Consumers are saying it. The question is, who's going to follow the playbook? Because in most environments, people think about research as dumping dollars down a black hole that they never see again. Chief science officers and chief researchers can elbow their chief marketing officer and say, hey, look, we can have a direct ROI tied to the spend. Mm-hmm. It makes it a lot easier for a brand in this industry who needs to decide between, well, do I do a sips to lip sampling campaign, or do I try to get this data with a third party group? Normally they can't spend everywhere, right? But this is a sips to lip sampling campaign and a research study that generates ROI if you use the data the right way. And let me be very clear about the type of study that this is. This is a non-interventional, meaning we're not telling people what product to use or how much of it to use. Observational, self-reported clinical study. All of those words together are true. Can you market the data compliantly without getting the FDA and the FTC upset at you? Well, just like dietary supplements companies market observational studies. You can do it legally. You can do it compliantly. You just also have to disclose the N number and disclose not just the rosy talking points, but some of the negative talking points. So that's kind of our expertise, is working with brands to translate this into marketable language. But to your point, if 63% of people are saying they're going to pay more, if they see the data, that really ought to give the marketers pause for the cause to think about how they can incorporate some of these data points into signage, packaging, etc.
Absolutely. So Kevin, I think the final question we can wrap up here is, where does this go from here? Obviously, we have an extra cohort, or cohort 2 coming out, but long term, how do you see infused beverage research evolving over the next couple of years here?
I think these type of studies really just shine a light on where more research needs to be done. It wasn't meant to answer any specific question definitively, right? So that's the first comment. The second is, for infused beverages, we need to get deeper insight on formulation, form factor, onset, and duration. So what most people want as consumers is predictability. I want to know if I'm buying a product and using a product, it's going to work the same way that it worked last time. It tastes the same as it tasted last time. That's cannabis in general, our biggest problem in the industry. Predictability, repeatability, right? Anyone who's ever had a gummy that went the wrong way knows this. Beverages are better in terms of, compared to gummies, less adverse events, less significantly bad negative outcomes. So part of that is just blood barrier, digestion, and what beverages can do that gummies can't. Some of that is formulation. Some of that is emulsification. Some of that is the can liner, right? So all of those things we are interested in studying deeper. And in the name of reliability and consistency, that's what we're looking to get to, is at what point do we have enough data where a consumer can walk into a store, look at a sign or a couple data points, ask the person behind the counter, and have a pretty high degree likelihood that they're going to get a product that A, they like, and B, works for them. That's what we need to get to. The second part of the answer is just more long-term studies on the impacts on alcohol, smoking, and long-term wellness. So what's cool is 3 weeks worth of data. What's cooler is 3 years worth of data from people who have given us longitudinal data for those 3 years. So that's part of what we're working on. And then look, man, outside of infused beverages, this sector or this industry needs a lot of data. So we're about to do a big industry edible study, a big industry inhalation study with different form factors and whatnot. So we're really interested in the minor cannabinoids because that's a black box of unknown data. So all of these are industry studies that will, in the next couple months, you guys will see some announcements with. But for infused beverages, this is really the beginning, I think. And the individual brands who went through cohort 1 and are going through cohort 2 feel the same way. They're getting some cool data. They're going to be able to market with it, but it almost just scratches the itch of where do we need to do more targeted, deeper dives in the future.
Awesome. Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your journey and breaking down that study for us, how it came together and everything. So as always, to the listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.